In this lesson, we are going to learn about how sectionalism arose from radical tension, including the Denmark-Vesey plot, slave codes, and the growth of the abolitionist movement. Sectionalism is loyalty to the interests of one's own region or section of the country, rather than to the country as a whole. These sectional differences developed after the ratification of the Constitution, as the economies, cultures, and political interests of the North and South became more and more different. In some ways, we could see the sectional differences developing at the Constitutional Convention, with aspects such as the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Commerce Compromise, etc. Now, sectionalism is loyalty to a particular region or section of the country. And because of the different cultures, political interests, and economies of the North and South, people in the South started to see themselves more as Southerners and the North as Northerners rather than Americans. And of course, this developed after the ratification of the Constitution. It wouldn't be until the 1800s that this sectionalism would become a major issue in the United States. But sectionalism would divide the country even more. The biggest issue that caused sectionalism was slavery. The North had started to emancipate slaves, and the South, of course, relied upon slaves for their entire economy. And the South said that slavery is not only good, slavery is positive good, as we learned previously. Once again, the ratification of the Constitution was the event that allowed all the states to become official members of the United States. Now, the economies of the North and South, the economies, political interests, and cultures of the North and South caused two very distinct and different regions to develop. And, of course, we learned that the North were primarily Federalists, while the South, which we did not exactly learn yet, with the exception of some Federalists like Charles Pinckney, it was 95% Democratic Republican. Now, the South, of course, most of the economies was based on agriculture. And this is because that due to the headright system, plantations became the norm in the South, and cash crops grown on plantations using slave labor was the entire basis of Southern economy. And everything else revolved around the economy, including the society, which was highly reliant upon slaves. Now, the North, due to the fact that up in New England, we had the Puritans who made their living, their economy was based on lumber, ships, and trade. It had become a region of trading and manufacturing. And even though some areas still grew crops, like in the breadbasket, they grew grain, most of that was done on small farms. And perhaps most important, and one of the biggest sources of sectional differences, was there were laws emancipating slaves. So these cultural, political, and economic differences of the North and South led to sectionalism. Now, sectionalism would increase with many events that we're about to learn about. Anytime the North and South felt differently about an event, such as a slave rebellion or a planned slave rebellion, sectionalism would increase. Before we get to that, let's look at the PowerPoints. So, in the colonial period, sectionalism first developed as a result of the different geographies of the region. Different policies also created these sectional differences. For instance, the headright system led to the plantations that were built, or the plantations that came about. And those places that had the headright system developed plantations. However, also, the North, due to the natural resource of trees, became a trading, shipping, and lumber region. Now, all regions had slaves prior to the American Revolution. However, once the war was over, the North gradually emancipated or freed their slaves. In the South, the cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney led the South to become even more dependent on slave labor. And as we learned, there were two political parties that came about. The first two political parties were the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The New Englanders and some wealthier people from Carolinas, although only about 5%, were Federalists, while the Southerners, being mostly farmers, and even South Carolina, we learned only 20% of the people owned slaves, they were primarily Democratic Republican. The political parties and regions increasingly took different positions on the issues of the day. This brings us to the next part, which will analyze some events that caused sectional differences in the U.S. So, first let's look at a timeline. In the year 1670, this is when Charleston began. Of course, it was called Charlestown. In 1720, South Carolina's had a population imbalance favoring slaves, or Africans, where there were more slaves than whites. And of course, the whites get scared. Well, in 1740, the fears were realized, and the Stono Rebellion occurs, and of course, the result of the Stono was a strengthening of the slave codes. Then, with the expiration of the Commerce Compromise, in 1808, the international slave trade stopped. However, as we already learned, slave numbers continued to grow from smuggling and birth rates. And slaves were highly desired because of the cotton that had been started to be grown everywhere after about the year 1800 with the invention of the cotton gin. This brings us to our next event that would increase sectionalism. Both of these events would increase sectionalism in the United States, which would further divide the North and South. In 1822, the event that would increase sectionalism, the Denmark-Vesey plot. Was an event that occurred in South Carolina. And I've already told you about the Denmark-Vesey story. And the story of Denmark-Vesey, who we're going to draw an awful drawing here. We could do better. But he was the slave that was a carpenter and earned his money on Sundays when he was off, and eventually won the lottery. Well, Denmark-Vesey then became a Methodist leader in Charleston. And this is when his good fortune ends, because he was a pretty prominent figure in in Charleston, and whether it was because of the fear of his leadership or if he was actually guilty, he was accused and convicted of planning a 1,000 slave uprising, similar to Stono, but on a much greater scale. And he and 36 of his co-conspirators were tried, convicted, and hung. Debate exists whether he was guilty or not, and I haven't done enough research to know. But this event, the Denmark-Vesey plot, this would increase sectionalism, because the North learned of this, and there was widespread popular belief that he was set up and wasn't guilty. And the South, of course, any slave rebellion elicited strong feelings. So, the Denmark-Vesey plot would increase sectionalism. Now, another slave rebellion occurred. The plot actually never occurred, but in 1831, the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia was a slave rebellion led by a slave named Matt Turner, and in this slave rebellion, 55 to 60 whites were killed and 200 African Americans. I will show you a chronology of this. I'm trying to draw an awful picture of Nat Turner that will not do him justice. He did have a nice beard. We'll go ahead and get him his beard here. And I'll show you a real picture that does justice to Nat Turner here. But this Nat Turner Rebellion and the Denmark-Vesey plot, both would increase sectionalism, and both resulted in, just like after Stono, the slave codes were strengthened even more until all aspects of slaves' lives were regulated. Let's take a look at the PowerPoint here, and see real pictures of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. So, from the timeline, sectionalism would intensify. And due to the growing slave population in the South, by the 1720s, the black population surpassed the white population, or a population imbalance existed. African Americans were the majority in most southern states. And by 1808, the international slave trade was outlawed, but the number of slaves continued to grow due to smuggling and birth rates, which led to an increased fear of slave revolts. The Denmark-Vesey plot caused South Carolina to become even more fearful of their slaves. Here's Denmark-Vesey, the slave that won his freedom by working as a carpenter and hitting the lottery. Here's another picture, the one I tried to copy. I know, I did a fair job. Now, the Nat Turner Rebellion, the Denmark-Vesey event did not actually occur. It was uncovered before it went down. But the Nat Turner Rebellion did. And Nat Turner was a slave in Virginia that led a slave rebellion that further increased tension throughout the region. It would increase sectionalism because the North, they started to see slavery as so bad that maybe violence was needed to stop it. However, to Southerners, any instance of rebellious slaves could not be tolerated. Southerners feared that if slavery could not expand, that there would be a major problem. We're going to learn about this in just a few minutes. Here's a picture of Nat Turner, the one I tried to copy. Yes, I did an awful job. I know. But it was quickly. I see I needed to make his face a little longer. We'll fix that in the future. So the last part of this lesson is about why Southerners saw the need for slavery to expand. And it was basic survival for slavery. And what causes a big increase in sectionalism is the Louisiana Purchase, which Thomas Jefferson acquired from France and Napoleon, so Napoleon could have money to fight his wars. Then Thomas Jefferson, as the one video we saw, sent Lewis and Clark on an expedition to survey it. Now, the big issue with the Louisiana Purchase was whether new states in the Louisiana Purchase would be free or if they would allow slavery. And the reason for this was because of the political control that would result. Now, in Congress, we've learned that there's the House and the Senate. Well, if the free states had control of these, they could pass laws to outlaw slavery. And as we'll learn in future lessons, the North already had control of the House. So the fight for the Senate would be a major problem. And this fight for the Senate would lead to greater sectional differences and perhaps even the Civil War. So it's over this control of Congress and the legislature that the Louisiana Purchase becomes such a key issue. And the Southerners said, hey, slavery has to expand here or we're going to have problems. And first, the North is going to outlaw slavery. And second, if that happens, we're going to have a large African American population that's mad at us because they were our slaves and that we can't control. So, this concludes the lesson today. In the next lesson, we'll learn about further things such as the abolitionist movement that would further increase sectionalism between the North and South, and about some other issues that you know about concerning slavery. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.